In the spring of 1922, archaeologist Leonard Woolley was excavating a burial shaft at the ancient Sumerian city of when his team's shovel struck something unexpected 8 feet below the surface. The cultural deposits they had been meticulously documenting, layers of pottery shards, charcoal remnants, and domestic debris that traced an unbroken line of human habitation, simply stopped. What lay beneath was a band of clean. Water-deposited clay stretching uniformly in every direction, completely sterile, containing no artifacts, no organic material, no evidence of human activity whatsoever. Woolley's first message to colleagues in London contained 4 words that would reverberate through archaeological circles for decades. We have found the flood. The clay layer extended to a depth of approximately 8 feet, representing a volume of water and sediment deposit that modern hydrologists estimate would require flooding of catastrophic and sustained magnitude, far beyond anything produced by seasonal Mesopotamian river overflow. Similar sterile clay horizons have since been identified at Kish, at Shuruppak, at Uruk, and at Lagash, all dating to the same narrow chronological window centered on approximately 2900 BC. But here is what conventional archaeology has consistently failed to address adequately. The flood Woolley found in Mesopotamia represents only one data point in a global pattern so consistent, so technically specific, and so precisely correlated across cultures that had absolutely no contact with one another, that the conventional explanation of independent mythological development becomes statistically and intellectually indefensible. More than 500 documented flood traditions exist in the archaeological and anthropological record. They span every inhabited continent. They describe the same duration of flooding. They reference the same celestial disturbances preceding the waters. They preserve the same survival methods, the same animal behavior warnings, and in dozens of cases the same precise measurements that appear in the Mesopotamian source tablets. The story we have been told about flood mythology, that it is regional religious allegory transmitted through cultural diffusion, cannot account for what the evidence actually shows. What follows is a systematic examination of that evidence, drawing on cuneiform tablets, geological core samples, ice record data, genetic population studies, and the flood traditions of civilizations separated by oceans and millennia who had no reason to agree unless they were all remembering the same catastrophic event. If this evidence challenges what you thought you knew about the origins of humanity's oldest stories, consider subscribing to follow this investigation further. The evidence we are about to examine spans every inhabited continent and multiple independent disciplines, drawing connections between Mesopotamian cuneiform tablets, Aboriginal Australian oral traditions, Mesoamerican codices, and geological records that together point toward a single, world-altering conclusion. The sterile clay layer Leonard Woolley discovered at in 1922 was not, as it turned out, the only geological interruption of its kind in Mesopotamia, nor was it the most dramatic. Excavations at Shuruppak, the very city named in Sumerian flood tablets as the home of the flood hero Zeus Sudra, conducted by Erich Schmidt of the University of Pennsylvania between 1931 and 1933, revealed a flood deposit horizon of comparable depth and composition that stratigraphic analysis placed at approximately 2900 BC. The deposit contained marine microfossils, specifically species of Foraminifera, whose nearest natural habitat lay hundreds of kilometers from the excavation site. Embedded within the clay matrix at depths that indicated transportation by water, moving with sufficient velocity and volume to carry ocean floor organisms far inland across the Mesopotamian plain. The presence of these marine indicators within a landlocked flood deposit far from any ocean coastline raised questions that Schmidt noted carefully in his field reports, but that mainstream archaeological interpretation has largely declined to address. What makes the Shuruppak deposit particularly significant is not merely its composition, but its stratigraphic relationship to the cultural layers surrounding it. Below the clay horizon, Schmidt's team documented a continuous sequence of Sumerian occupation going back to approximately 4000 BC, with pottery styles, architectural remains, and domestic artifacts showing gradual uninterrupted development across more than 1,000 years of settled habitation. Above the clay horizon, after an estimated gap of between 50 and 100 years during which the site appears to have been completely uninhabited, A new cultural layer begins. The pottery is different. The architectural techniques show changes. The material culture, while clearly connected to what came before, displays innovations and discontinuities consistent with a population that had been disrupted, dispersed, and was rebuilding. Schmidt described this pattern in his 1935 report to the University of Pennsylvania as evidence of a catastrophic abandonment event, followed by recolonization from a different population source. The mainstream interpretation has framed this as evidence of a localized river flood, but the marine microfossil content of the deposit argues against any explanation rooted in normal Mesopotamian hydrology. The Tigris and Euphrates do not carry foraminifera from ocean floors. The presence of these organisms in the deposit at Shuruppak requires a mechanism of water transport connecting the inland Mesopotamian plain to open ocean sources, a mechanism that routine river flooding cannot provide but that a massive coastal inundation, driven by tsunami activity or catastrophic sea level change, could. Woolley himself recognized the broader implications of what he had found at though he was careful in his public statements to frame the discovery within biblical context rather than allowing the geological evidence to drive his interpretation. His 1931 popular account, of the Chaldees, described the clay layer as the flood of the Sumerian king list, connecting it to the Ziusudra narrative and by extension to the Genesis account of Noah. But Woolley's field notes, archived at the British Museum and examined in detail by archaeologist Paul Zimanski in his 1993 reassessment published in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies, reveal a more complex and more troubling picture. The clay layer at extended not just beneath the royal cemetery, as commonly reported, but across an area of the site that Woolley estimated conservatively at several square kilometres, representing a deposit volume that his own calculations suggested required sustained inundation to a depth of at least 7.5 metres above the original ground surface. 7.5 metres of standing water does not result from seasonal flooding of the Euphrates. It does not result from a dam failure upstream. It requires a volume of water arriving faster than drainage can remove it, and sustaining that depth long enough to deposit a uniform clay horizon across kilometres of open plain. The consistency of flood deposit horizons across multiple Mesopotamian sites, each independently dated to the same narrow chronological window, transforms what might otherwise be interpreted as a local geological event into something that demands a regional or global explanation. At Kish, excavations conducted by the Field Museum and Oxford University Joint Expedition between 1923 and 1933 under the direction of Stephen Langdon identified a flood layer at a depth consistent with the Shuruppak and deposits, though Langdon's dating placed it slightly earlier at approximately 3200 BC, suggesting either multiple flooding events or regional variation in the timing of a single large-scale inundation. At Uruk, the site that represents the earliest known urban centre in human history, German excavations under Julius Jordan in the 1920s documented sedimentary interruptions in the cultural sequence that correspond chronologically to the flood deposits at other sites. The pattern across these multiple independent excavations is not consistent with localized river flooding, which would affect different sites at different times according to local drainage geography. It is consistent with a single regional event of sufficient magnitude to deposit uniform sedimentary horizons across the entire southern Mesopotamian plain simultaneously. When anthropologist James George Fraser systematically catalogued global flood traditions for his 1918 study Folklore in the Old Testament, he documented more than 250 independent accounts from cultures spanning every inhabited continent. Subsequent researchers, including Dorothy Vitaliano, whose 1973 work Legends of the Earth examined geological origins of ancient myths, and more recently Bruce Masai of Los Alamos National Laboratory, whose cross-cultural analysis published in the journal Geological Society of America Special Papers in 2007 extended the catalogue to more than 500 independent traditions, found something that the sheer volume of accounts obscures. It is not merely that these cultures all describe a great flood. It is that they describe the same flood using the same specific technical details, the same duration of 150 days that appears in both Mesopotamian tablets and Genesis, the same celestial disturbances preceding the waters, the same unusual animal behaviour as a warning sign, and in dozens of cases the same precise measurements for water levels that correspond to specific geological markers now identifiable in the sediment record. The analytical challenge posed by this convergence is not one that mainstream scholarship has engaged with systematically or satisfactorily. The conventional response to cross-cultural flood traditions has been to propose either independent mythological invention, the argument that flooding is a universal human experience, and therefore flood stories will emerge independently in all cultures, or cultural diffusion, the argument that flood narratives spread from a single source through ancient trade and migration routes. Neither explanation survives rigorous scrutiny when applied to the full dataset. The independent invention hypothesis fails because it cannot account for the technical specificity of the shared details. Flooding is indeed a universal human experience, but 150 days as the specific duration of peak inundation is not a detail that independent invention would be expected to generate consistently. It is a measurement. Measurements require observation of a specific event. The diffusion hypothesis fails because it cannot account for the geographical distribution of the accounts, particularly the presence of technically specific flood traditions among populations in Australia, the Americas, and the Pacific Islands, whose isolation from Old World contact prior to the modern period is well established. Mass's 2007 analysis approached the problem with the methodological rigour it deserves, treating the flood tradition dataset as a body of historical testimony and applying the same analytical standards used for any other large dataset of independent witness accounts. His methodology identified 32 specific narrative elements that appeared across multiple independent traditions and subjected their distribution to statistical analysis. The results were unambiguous. The probability of the observed pattern of specific technical detail convergence arising through independent invention was, in Mass's words, effectively zero. The specific elements that showed the highest cross-cultural consistency were not the broad narrative elements of divine punishment and survival that diffusionist models might predict, but the precise technical parameters, the duration of flooding, the specific height of water above normal levels, the seasonal timing of the event, the celestial phenomena observed immediately before the flooding began, and the specific survival methods employed. These are the details that witnesses of an actual event would preserve and that mythological invention would not reliably generate independently. The celestial dimension of Mass's analysis is particularly significant. Across more than 200 of the 500 traditions he examined, the flood account includes a description of an unusual object or phenomenon in the sky immediately preceding the onset of flooding. These descriptions are not uniform in their imagery, which argues against simple narrative borrowing, but they are consistent in their structural role within the account and in the specific characteristics they attribute to the observed phenomenon. A bright object appearing suddenly, moving across the sky, generating light and sound, and being followed within days by catastrophic flooding. That description, appearing in Mesopotamian, Mesoamerican, Pacific and Aboriginal Australian traditions with equivalent structural placement in the narrative, is consistent with a single class of observed natural event. It is the description of a bolide impact. The Eridu Genesis tablet catalogued as CBS 10,673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology represents the oldest written flood account yet discovered on Earth, and its relationship to the biblical narrative of Noah has been one of the most carefully avoided subjects in mainstream religious scholarship since its translation was completed by Thorkild Jacobsen in 1981. The tablet, composed in Sumerian and dating to approximately 2100 BC, but drawing on oral traditions that archaeologists estimate extend back to at least 3500 BC, describes a divine council convening to send a great flood. A righteous man named Ziusudra receiving advance warning from a deity named Enki, and a vessel constructed to specific technical dimensions that preserved both human and animal life through the catastrophe. The precision of these details is not the imprecision of mythology. The vessel dimensions recorded in the tablet correspond to structural ratios that modern naval architects recognize as functionally sound for open water survival in extreme conditions. The tablet itself is fragmentary, consisting of 3 columns of text with significant lacunae that Jacobsen's translation carefully acknowledged. But what survives is sufficient to establish the structural and narrative relationship between the Sumerian account and the later biblical version with complete certainty. The divine warning to Ziusudra is delivered through the wall of a house, a detail that the Atrahasis epic, the later Akkadian version of the same tradition catalogued as BM 78941 in the British Museum collection, elaborates into a scene where the god Enki speaks to the hero through a reed screen, instructing him not to look directly at the deity but to listen and follow specific technical instructions for vessel construction. This detail, the indirect communication through a physical barrier, appears in the later biblical account as the voice of God speaking to Noah, and its presence in the Sumerian source establishes that it was not a later theological development, but an original feature of the tradition preserved across multiple retellings. The specificity of the communication method, the particular physical arrangement described, argues against mythological invention and toward the preservation of an actual account of how information was received and understood. The vessel dimensions described in the Eridu Genesis tablet, though partially obscured by the fragmentary condition of the text, were analysed by naval architect Samuel Noah Kramer in his 1956 study History Begins at Sumer, which identified the proportional relationships between the described dimensions as consistent with a vessel designed for stability in open water rather than for river navigation. The distinction is critical. A vessel designed for Mesopotamian river conditions would be long, narrow and shallow, optimized for maneuverability in confined channels with variable current. The vessel described in the Sumerian tablets is proportioned for buoyancy and stability in conditions where wave action from multiple directions must be managed, the design characteristics of a sea-going vessel or a survival craft intended for open ocean conditions. Someone describing a mythological boat would have no particular reason to specify the proportions that maximize open water stability. Someone recording the actual specifications of a vessel that successfully survived catastrophic flooding would preserve exactly those proportions. The 11th tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, discovered in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh by Hormuzd Rassam in 1872 and currently housed as Tablet K 3375 in the British Museum collection, caused what can only be described as a theological crisis when George Smith translated its contents and read them aloud at a meeting of the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London on the 3rd of December, 1872. The audience sat in stunned silence as Smith presented a Babylonian account of a universal flood, a vessel built to divine specifications, animals loaded 2 by 2, a dove and a raven released to find land, and a hero who survived and received divine blessing. A narrative so structurally identical to the Genesis account that the London Daily Telegraph immediately offered a £1,000 prize for further tablet fragments. What Smith had found was not a parallel story or a thematic cousin. It was the same story, recorded on clay tablets that predated the biblical composition by centuries, raising questions about the direction of transmission that mainstream biblical scholarship has spent 150 years attempting to answer without fully confronting. The specific details that Smith read aloud that December evening in London went far beyond thematic similarity. The flood hero of the Babylonian account, Utnapishtim, receives his warning from the god Ea, the Akkadian equivalent of the Sumerian Enki, in a scene structurally identical to the Eridu Genesis account. The vessel is sealed with bitumen and pitch applied in multiple coats, a construction detail that appears in Genesis chapter 6 verse 14 virtually word for word. The flood lasts for 7 days of rain, followed by a sustained period of inundation, after which the waters begin to recede. Utnapishtim releases a dove, which returns having found no resting place, then a swallow, which also returns, and finally a raven, which does not return, indicating that dry land has appeared. Genesis chapter 8 describes Noah following the same sequence in the same order, releasing a raven first in the biblical version, then a dove twice, a minor variation that actually strengthens rather than weakens the case for common origin, as independent mythological invention would be expected to produce more substantial narrative differences, not minor sequential variations in an otherwise identical protocol. The Gilgamesh account provides technical details about the vessel's construction that exceed what appears in the surviving Eridu Genesis fragments and that have been analysed in detail by scholars including Andrew George of the University of London, whose 2003 critical edition of the Gilgamesh epic examined the vessel specifications in the context of known Mesopotamian shipbuilding practices. The vessel described to Utnapishtim as a cube, approximately 60 metres on each side, with 7 internal decks creating a total floor area of approximately 38,000 square metres. George noted that these dimensions, while impractical for a functional vessel in the conventional nautical sense, encode a specific mathematical relationship. The total internal volume of the described vessel corresponds precisely to the internal volume of the Great Ziggurat of Ur, the most sacred structure in Sumerian religious architecture. This is not a coincidence. It is deliberate encoding of sacred numerical relationships within the narrative specifications, indicating that the tradition was being transmitted and recorded by individuals who possessed both the mathematical knowledge to calculate volumetric equivalencies and the cultural motivation to embed those equivalencies in the text. The geological record preserved in ice cores extracted from the Greenland ice sheet by the Greenland Ice Core project between 1989 and 1992 contains a layer of extraordinary significance at a depth corresponding to approximately 12,900 years ago. At this precise horizon, researchers identified simultaneous increases in dust concentrations, charcoal particles, platinum group elements, and nanodiamonds, a chemical signature consistent with a large-scale extraterrestrial impact event. The layer marks the onset of the Younger Dryas period, a rapid climate reversal that plunged global temperatures by as much as 15 degrees Celsius within decades, triggering glacial readvance, catastrophic flooding from ice sheet melt, and the extinction of approximately 75% of large mammal species in North America within a geologically instantaneous time frame. What the standard presentation of the Younger Dryas consistently omits is that dozens of ancient flood traditions do not describe the flood beginning with rain. They describe it beginning with fire. The Hopi account specifies that the blue star appeared and the world burned before the waters came. The Aztec codices describe the fourth sun ending in a rain of fire followed by flooding. The Mesopotamian account in the Atrahasis epic states that Era unleashed weapons of flame before the deluge began. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, as the proposed extraterrestrial trigger for this climate event is formally designated in the geological literature, was first systematically presented by James Kennett of the University of California, Santa Barbara, and a team of 24 co-authors in a 2007 paper published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The paper presented evidence from 23 sites across North America of a thin but chemically anomalous sediment layer at the Younger Dryas boundary, containing nanodiamonds of a type produced exclusively under the high-temperature, high-pressure conditions of impact or detonation events, magnetic spherules consistent with melted and resolidified extraterrestrial material, iridium and platinum concentrations exceeding background crustal levels by factors of up to 20, and a black mat of carbon-rich material indicating continent-scale burning that terminated abruptly with the onset of Younger Dryas conditions. The simultaneous appearance of all these impact proxies across sites separated by thousands of kilometers, from California to Michigan to the Carolinas, argued strongly against any geological explanation and toward a single large-scale impact or airburst event of the kind that could only be produced by a fragmented comet or asteroid encountering Earth's atmosphere over the North American ice sheet. The scale of the inferred burning event is almost incomprehensible from a human perspective. Isotopic analysis of the carbon-rich black mat layer, conducted by Alan West of Geoscience Consulting and published in the Journal of Geology in 2010, indicated that the burning affected an estimated area of approximately 50 million square kilometers across the Northern Hemisphere, encompassing virtually all of North America and extending across the North Atlantic into Northern Europe. This is not a forest fire. It is not a series of forest fires. It is a burning event of continental scale, occurring essentially instantaneously from a geological perspective, that would have incinerated every living thing in its path and produced a global atmospheric loading of particulate matter, carbon dioxide, and toxic combustion products sufficient to trigger the climate reversal recorded in the ice cores. The ancient traditions that describe fire preceding the flood are not inserting a narrative element for dramatic effect. They are preserving the memory of a sequence of events that the geological record now confirms actually occurred in precisely that order. The fire came first, then came the floods. As the massive quantities of ice melted by the heat pulse, destabilized the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, and sent enormous volumes of meltwater cascading into drainage systems that could not accommodate them, raising sea levels rapidly and generating tsunami activity along every coastline that bordered the meltwater pathways. The specific detail of the blue star appearing in the sky, preserved in Hopi tradition as the trigger event for the destruction of the Third World, corresponds with remarkable precision to the visual appearance of a large comet or fragmented bolide in Earth's atmosphere. A major impact object entering the atmosphere at typical cometary velocities would appear as an intensely bright point of light, initially blue-white in colour due to the ionization of atmospheric gases ahead of the shockwave, visible across an enormous geographical area during its final approach. The Hopi term for this object, Sakwasohu, the blue star Kachina, describes not a metaphorical divine sign, but a specific visual observation made by people who witnessed something in the sky that preceded the destruction of their world. The consistency of this celestial precursor observation across dozens of independent flood traditions, each describing a bright object in the sky in the days or hours before the flooding began, represents a body of corroborating eyewitness testimony that the geological impact evidence now allows us to evaluate against a known physical event. The traditions and the geology are describing the same thing from different vantage points across time, and the convergence between them is not coincidental. Among the Hopi people of the American Southwest, whose oral traditions have been maintained through an unbroken chain of transmission, that ethnographers including Jesse Walter Fuchs, who conducted the first systematic documentation of Hopi ceremonial knowledge between 1891 and 1903, and Eckhard Malotki, whose comprehensive linguistic analysis of Hopi flood traditions was published in 2002, estimate extends back at least 10,000 years. The account of the Great Flood contains a detail so specific that conventional anthropology has struggled to explain it. The Hopi tradition states with precision that the flood lasted exactly 150 days before the waters began to recede. This is not a vague description of prolonged flooding, it is a specific numerical claim. That same number, 150 days, appears in Genesis chapter 7 verse 24. It appears in the Mesopotamian flood tablets from Nippur. And it appears in the accounts of at least 9 other geographically isolated cultures documented by Bruce Mass's survey, cultures that had no theoretical pathway of contact with either the Hopi or the Mesopotamian source material. The Hopi tradition preserves its flood account within a cosmological framework that describes the current world as the Fourth World. The 3 preceding worlds each having been destroyed through different mechanisms before the survivors of each destruction emerged into the next. The third world, the one destroyed by water, is described in Hopi oral tradition with a level of technical and observational specificity that distinguishes it from the broadly mythological framing that surrounds it. Elders interviewed by ethnographer Frank Waters, whose 1963 study Book of the Hopi compiled oral accounts from 30 Hopi elders over a period of 3 years, consistently described the flood as arriving from all 4 directions simultaneously. A detail that matches the geological signature of a tsunami event generated by multiple simultaneous impact points in the surrounding ocean, rather than a linear wave front produced by a single localized source. The waters did not come from one direction and spread. They converged. This distinction between a directional flood and a convergent inundation is not a detail that mythological invention would be expected to generate. But it is precisely what witnesses of a multi-source tsunami event would observe and preserve. The Hopi survival method described in their flood tradition adds another layer of technical specificity. The people who survived the Third World's destruction did so by sealing themselves inside hollow reeds that floated on the water's surface until they were guided to the emergence point of the Fourth World. The reed survival vessel, dismissed by conventional analysis as obvious symbolic imagery, appears in the Mesopotamian Atrahasis tradition in a remarkably similar form. The tablet fragment catalogued as BM 78942 in the British Museum collection describes Enki instructing the flood hero to build his vessel from the materials of the reed house in which they were speaking, a reed structure sealed with bitumen. The functional principle in both accounts is identical. a sealed, buoyant vessel constructed from lightweight organic material, waterproof to prevent flooding, capable of supporting human occupants through sustained inundation. The Hopi and the Mesopotamians, separated by the entire breadth of the North American continent and the Atlantic Ocean, describe the same survival technology using their own locally available materials. The Hopi used what they had. The Mesopotamians used what they had. The principle they were both preserving came from the same place. Molotky's 2002 linguistic analysis of Hopi flood terminology, published in the volume Hopi Tales of Destruction by the University of Nebraska Press, revealed that the Hopi words used to describe the duration of the flood, the height of the waters, and the behaviour of the receding inundation are drawn from a specialised vocabulary that does not appear in any other context within the Hopi language. This linguistic isolation is significant. It indicates that these terms were not generated from within the normal Hopi linguistic system, but were preserved as technical descriptors for a specific historical event, maintained through ceremonial transmission without being absorbed into everyday usage. Linguists call this phenomenon lexical fossilization, the preservation of vocabulary items in specialized ritual or historical contexts after their everyday usage has ceased. The presence of fossilized technical flood vocabulary in the Hopi language argues strongly that the tradition is preserving the memory of an actual observed event for which specific descriptive terms were necessary, not a mythological construct that would naturally draw on existing vocabulary. The Bundjalung people of the northern New South Wales coast of Australia maintain one of the oldest continuously documented oral traditions on Earth, with linguistic and cultural dating placing the origins of their flood narrative at a minimum of 7,000 years ago and potentially as far back as 12,000 years. Corresponding to the period of post-glacial sea level rise that inundated the continental shelf of eastern Australia and permanently submerged what had previously been inhabited lowland territory, extending hundreds of kilometres beyond the present coastline. The Bundjalung account of the Great Flood of Naradan describes the rainbow serpent stirring the primordial waters and drowning the ancient world, with waters rising for 7 days and 7 nights before remaining at peak level for an extended period and then gradually receding. What makes this account remarkable is not its existence, but its geological precision. Bathymetric surveys of the Australian continental shelf conducted by Geoscience Australia between 2000 and 2008 identified submerged river valleys, lake beds, and coastal formations that confirm the existence of extensive habitable lowland terrain that was progressively inundated as sea levels rose following the last glacial maximum, with the most dramatic flooding phases corresponding precisely to the timeframes described in Bundjalung oral tradition. The research of Patrick Nunn of the University of the Sunshine Coast and Nicholas Reed of the University of New England, whose collaborative analysis published in the Australian Geographer in 2015 examined 18 specific Aboriginal Australian traditions describing coastal inundation events, established a methodological framework for evaluating these oral accounts against datable geological changes. Their analysis identified traditions from 14 different Aboriginal language groups that contained specific, testable geographical claims about former coastlines, submerged features, and inundation sequences. In every case where the described features could be identified against bathymetric survey data, the traditions proved accurate. They described real places, real coastline configurations, and real inundation sequences that the geological record confirmed had existed before the post-glacial sea level rise. The oldest traditions in their dataset, including elements of the Bundjalung flood account, described coastal configurations corresponding to sea levels of approximately 120 metres below current levels, the condition that prevailed during the last glacial maximum approximately 20,000 years ago, establishing that the traditions had been accurately maintained across a minimum of 20,000 years of transmission. The Yuin people of the southern New South Wales coast preserve a flood tradition that provides complementary detail to the Bundjalung account, describing not just the rising of the waters, but the specific appearance of the coastline before the inundation, their tradition, documented by anthropologist A.W. Howitt in his 1888 study The Dieri and Other Kindred Tribes of Central Australia, and in his 1904 work Native Tribes of Southeast Australia, describes a time when the land extended far to the east of the current shoreline, and when people could walk to islands that are now separated from the mainland by deep water. Marine surveys of the relevant continental shelf area have confirmed the existence of submerged land bridges and former island connections at depths corresponding to the sea levels that prevailed between 15,000 and 8,000 years ago, providing direct geological confirmation of the geographical details preserved in the Yuin oral tradition. The precision of this geographical memory across a minimum of 8,000 years of transmission is not consistent with mythological invention. It is consistent with the careful preservation of an eyewitness historical account through a transmission system designed specifically to maintain accuracy. Among the technical details that appear with inexplicable consistency across flood traditions from cultures separated by oceans and continents, perhaps none is more specific or more analytically revealing than the description of the survival vessel's waterproofing material. The Cherokee tradition of the Nightland people describes survivors building boats sealed with pine pitch. A detail recorded by ethnographer James Mooney during his extensive fieldwork with Cherokee communities between 1887 and 1890, published in his 1900 Bureau of American Ethnology report on Cherokee myths. The Masai people of East Africa, whose flood tradition documents the survival of one righteous man who built a boat before the waters covered the highest mountains, describe the vessel's construction using acacia wood sealed with animal fat, rendered to a specific consistency that would provide waterproof adhesion to the hull seams. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes Utnapishtim sealing his vessel with bitumen and pitch, applied in multiple layers to specific depths. Genesis chapter 6 verse 14 instructs Noah to coat the ark inside and out with pitch. The specific technical requirement of a pitch or resin waterproofing compound, applied in multiple coats to ensure watertight integrity, appears independently across these traditions with a consistency that purely mythological development cannot plausibly generate. The chemistry of waterproofing is not intuitive. The requirement to seal a wooden vessel against sustained water penetration demands materials with specific properties including adhesion to wet wood surfaces, resistance to softening under prolonged water immersion, flexibility sufficient to accommodate the movement of a wooden hull without cracking, and durability across extended periods. Pine pitch, animal fat rendered to specific viscosity, bitumen, and the various other waterproofing compounds described across different flood traditions are all materials that satisfy these specific chemical requirements. The fact that different cultures independently identified locally available materials that fulfill the same technical function is less remarkable than the fact that they all preserve the technical requirement itself, the knowledge that a vessel intended for sustained open water survival must be specifically waterproofed in a way that ordinary wooden construction does not provide. This is shipbuilding knowledge of a practical and specific kind. Its presence across cultures with no contact pathway indicates that what is being preserved is not a story about a boat, but a technical protocol for constructing a survival vessel, a protocol preserved because it was once actually used. The Masai account, documented in detail by British colonial officer and amateur ethnographer Arthur Newman in his 1898 memoir Elephant Hunting in East Equatorial Africa, and subsequently analysed by flood tradition researcher Alan Duns in his 1988 anthology The Flood Myth, contains additional technical details that extend well beyond the waterproofing description. The Masai tradition specifies that the flood survivor loaded his vessel with male and female pairs of all domesticated animals and with seeds of all food plants, preserving them in sealed containers that the text describes as clay pots stoppered with wax. The specific instruction to preserve plant genetic material in sealed containers alongside live animals represents an understanding of survival logistics that goes beyond simple narrative description. It reflects knowledge of what would actually be required to re-establish agricultural and pastoral society after a catastrophic event, knowledge that presupposes experience with or planning for civilizational reconstruction at a level that is inconsistent with simple mythological storytelling. One of the most consistently overlooked features of global flood traditions, and one of the most analytically significant, is the widespread description of astronomical anomalies occurring immediately before the floodwaters began to rise. These are not vague references to divine displeasure expressed through weather. They are specific observational descriptions of changes in the night sky that modern astrophysics can evaluate against known astronomical events. Tahitian flood tradition documented by missionary William Ellis during his residence in the Society Islands between 1817 and 1822, and published in his Polynesian Researches of 1831, describes the god Taroa causing the waters to rise during a time when the stars danced differently in the sky. Hawaiian tradition, recorded in the Kumuhonua legends preserved in the Bishop Museum manuscript collection, describes the vault of heaven appearing to crack before the flood began. The Mesopotamian Atrahasis epic, translated from tablets catalogued as BM 78941 in the British Museum collection, describes the appearance of a great light in the sky accompanied by a sound like thunder on a clear night before the first rains fell. These descriptions, taken together, are consistent with the visual phenomena that witnesses would observe during a major bolide impact event, including atmospheric plasma trails, sonic booms from fragmentation, and the optical effects of massive quantities of particulate matter entering the upper atmosphere simultaneously. The description of stars dancing differently in Tahitian tradition requires careful analysis because it is not describing the ordinary movement of stars across the night sky, which every culture in the world observed and catalogued. It is describing a departure from the expected pattern, a change in how the stars appeared to move or in what positions they occupied relative to their normal configuration. This description is consistent with several phenomena that would accompany a major impact event. The introduction of massive quantities of dust and particulate matter into the upper atmosphere following an impact or airburst would create optical scattering effects that altered the apparent brightness and colour of stars, making them appear to flicker, shift, or dance in ways inconsistent with normal atmospheric seeing conditions. Additionally, the atmospheric shock wave from a major impact would create visible distortion effects in the lower atmosphere that would distort stellar images for observers at distances of thousands of kilometres from the impact site. Both phenomena would be described by witnesses without the conceptual vocabulary of modern atmospheric physics as the stars dancing differently. The Hawaiian Kumuhonua description of the vault of heaven appearing to crack is even more specific in its observational content. The vault of heaven in Hawaiian cosmological vocabulary refers to the visible dome of the night sky, and its apparent cracking or splitting would describe a visual phenomenon of extraordinary brightness and extent crossing that dome. The description matches precisely the visual appearance of a major bolide fragmentation event in the upper atmosphere, during which a single large object breaking apart produces a series of intensely bright impact trails spreading across a wide arc of sky, creating the impression that the sky itself has been torn open. Victor Klube and Bill Napier's analysis of ancient astronomical texts in their 1990 work, The Cosmic Winter, identified this class of description, the splitting or cracking of the sky, as appearing in traditions from at least 11 independent cultures across 4 continents, all associated with flood accounts. The consistency of this specific visual description across cultures with no contact pathway, combined with its physical correspondence to a known class of astronomical event, constitutes a category of evidence that the conventional mythological interpretation cannot adequately address. The chemical signature preserved in sediment cores extracted from sites across North America, Europe and Asia, at the stratigraphic boundary corresponding to 12,900 years ago, represents one of the most significant and one of the most contested datasets in contemporary geology. James Kennett of the University of California, Santa Barbara, whose research group published initial findings in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2007, identified a suite of impact proxies at this boundary layer, including nanodiamonds of a type produced only by high-temperature, high-pressure impact events, microscopic spherules of melted and resolidified rock, iridium concentrations exceeding background levels by factors consistent with extraterrestrial material, and carbon-rich black matte deposits indicating continent-scale burning. The Younger Dryas boundary layer, as this horizon is now designated in the geological literature, has been confirmed at more than 50 sites across 4 continents, with platinum anomalies alone documented at locations as geographically separated as Greenland, central Mexico and Belgium. A distribution pattern that indicates not a single localized impact, but a fragmented object whose pieces struck across the northern hemisphere over a period of hours or days. The scientific debate surrounding the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis has been one of the most contentious in contemporary geology, with critics including Nicholas Pinter of the University of California, Davis, and Mark Boslow of Sandia National Laboratory's publishing challenges to the impact interpretation in journals, including Earth Science Reviews and the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Their primary objections centered on the reproducibility of the nanodiamond identifications and on the statistical methodology used to establish the correlation between impact proxies and the Younger Dryas onset. These are legitimate scientific objections that the research community has taken seriously. What is significant for the present analysis is how the debate has evolved as additional data has accumulated. The 2012 study by Vitka and colleagues, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, presented nanodiamond evidence from 21 additional sites not included in the original 2007 paper, and introduced independent confirmation from a new analytical technique, transmission electron microscopy, that identified the specific crystalline structure of the nanodiamonds as lonsdaleite, a hexagonal diamond polymorph that does not form through terrestrial geological processes but has been identified in meteorites. The lonsdaleite identification was significant because it addressed the central reproducibility objection. Lonsdaleite has a specific and unambiguous crystalline signature that cannot be confused with other carbon structures. Its presence in sediment layers at multiple sites across 4 continents at the same stratigraphic horizon is not a measurement artifact. It is physical evidence of extraterrestrial material deposited simultaneously across a vast geographical area. The flooding consequences of the proposed Younger Dryas impact event extend well beyond the immediate destruction caused by the impact itself. The Laurentide ice sheet, which at 12,900 years ago still covered most of Canada and extended into the northern United States, contained an estimated volume of water equivalent to a global sea level rise of approximately 60 to 70 meters if fully melted. The ice sheet was already in a state of progressive melting associated with the warming of the preceding Bolling-Alarod period, and the heat pulse generated by a major impact event over the ice sheet would have dramatically accelerated this melting process. Geological evidence for rapid ice sheet destabilization at the Younger Dryas boundary has been documented by geologist Paul Majewski of the University of Maine, whose analysis of Greenland ice core data, published in Science in 1993, identified a collapse in ice sheet accumulation rates at this horizon consistent with sudden warming followed by the equally sudden cooling of the Younger Dryas. The meltwater pulses generated by this destabilization would have raised sea levels globally by several meters within decades, inundating coastal areas that had been inhabited for thousands of years and producing the flooding events recorded in traditions worldwide. The convergence of the impact evidence, the ice core climate data, and the global flood tradition record is not coincidental. These independent lines of evidence are all describing the consequences of the same event. Population genetics has provided an entirely independent line of evidence that converges on the same conclusion suggested by flood traditions and geological catastrophe markers, that the human population experienced one or more severe reduction events during prehistoric periods from which only a small number of survivors expanded to repopulate the Earth. The mitochondrial DNA studies conducted by Lynn Jord and colleagues at the University of Utah, published in the American Journal of Human Genetics in 2000, identified patterns of genetic diversity in modern human populations consistent with a population bottleneck occurring approximately 70,000 years ago, associated with the Toba supervolcano eruption, that reduced the global human breeding population to an estimated minimum of between 2,000 and 10,000 individuals. More recently, analysis of Y chromosome haplogroup distribution patterns by Monica Carmin and colleagues, published in Genome Research in 2015, identified a dramatic reduction in male lineage diversity occurring approximately 5,000 to 7,000 years ago, a bottleneck so severe and so geographically widespread that the authors described it as representing a collapse of male effective population size to roughly 1/17 of female effective population size during the same period. The Carmin bottleneck, as it has come to be designated in the population genetics literature, is one of the most puzzling findings in recent human genomic research, and the explanations offered for it by mainstream scholarship are almost uniformly unsatisfying when examined in detail. The bottleneck affects male lineages globally and simultaneously, with Y chromosome diversity collapsing across populations in Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas within the same narrow chronological window of approximately 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. Female lineage diversity, tracked through mitochondrial DNA, shows no corresponding collapse during this period, meaning that whatever caused the male lineage reduction either specifically targeted males or represents a pattern of social organization in which a small number of males fathered a disproportionate number of offspring across the entire global population simultaneously. The social explanation, sometimes called the warrior hypothesis, proposes that the transition to patriarchal clan warfare during this period allowed dominant male lineages to eliminate competing males and monopolize reproduction. But this explanation requires the same social transformation to have occurred independently and simultaneously across every inhabited continent, including populations with no contact with one another, which presents the same logical problem as the independent invention explanation for flood tradition convergence. The alternative interpretation that the Kármán bottleneck represents a genuine population reduction event caused by a global catastrophe has been explored by geneticist David Reich of Harvard Medical School, whose 2018 study Who We Are and How We Got Here examined ancient DNA evidence from hundreds of prehistoric skeletal remains across Eurasia. Reich's analysis identified multiple periods of dramatic population replacement and reduction in the ancient DNA record, including events in the period corresponding to the Younger Dryas boundary that left distinctive signatures in the genetic profiles of populations across the Northern Hemisphere. The populations that occupied Europe and Western Asia before the Younger Dryas boundary show genetic profiles that are largely absent from populations after it, suggesting that the catastrophic events of 12,900 years ago did not merely reduce population numbers, but effectively replaced much of the genetic heritage of pre-catastrophe populations with the lineages of a small number of survivors who subsequently expanded to repopulate their regions. The 8 survivors motif that appears across multiple flood traditions, including the Hebrew account of Noah and his family, the Babylonian account preserved in the Gilgamesh tablets, the Hawaiian Kumuhonua tradition, and the Chinese flood narrative preserved in the Shujing takes on new significance when examined alongside population genetic evidence for severe bottleneck events. 8 individuals is not a number that mythological invention would be expected to generate as a symbolic survival count. It is too small to be meaningfully symbolic in most cultural contexts, and too specific to be a convenient approximation. But 8 individuals is precisely the order of magnitude that population genetics predicts for the founding group of a lineage that subsequently expands to constitute a significant portion of a regional population, given reasonable assumptions about founding group fertility and the selective advantages of the survival knowledge they would have possessed. The consistency of the 8 survivors number across independent traditions may be preserving not a symbolic or theological claim, but an actual demographic memory of the scale of survival from a catastrophic event. The flood traditions preserved within the Vedic corpus and the later Puranic literature of the Indian subcontinent represent one of the most mathematically sophisticated and chronologically detailed bodies of flood knowledge in the ancient world, and their relationship to the geological and archaeological record of the Indian subcontinent has received remarkably little systematic attention from mainstream scholarship. The Shatapatha Brahmana, one of the oldest prose texts in the Vedic canon, dated by scholarly consensus to approximately 800 to 600 BC, but drawing on oral traditions that Indological researchers including Jan Gonda have argued extend back to at least 1500 BC, contains a flood narrative centered on a figure named Manu who receives warning from a great fish later identified with the god Vishnu. The fish instructs Manu to build a great vessel and to take aboard the seeds of all plants and the 7 holy sages, providing specific construction instructions and a precise time frame for the flooding event. What distinguishes the Vedic account from a simple mythological parallel is the level of astronomical and calendrical specificity embedded in the narrative, including references to specific stellar positions and seasonal indicators that allow astronomers using modern software to calculate the approximate date being described. The astronomical specificity of the Manu flood narrative has been examined in detail by researcher Bal Gangadhar Tilak, whose 1893 study, Orion, or Researches into the Antiquity of the Vedas, analysed the stellar references embedded in Vedic flood accounts and proposed dates for the described events based on the precession of the equinoxes. Tilak's methodology, applied to the specific stellar positions described in the Shatapatha Brahmana flood account, produced a date range centered on approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago for the astronomical conditions described in the narrative, placing the Vedic flood memory within the same chronological window as the Younger Dryas boundary event. More recently, astronomers Narahari Achar of the University of Memphis and Subhash Kak of Louisiana State University have applied computer modeling of stellar precession to the Vedic astronomical references, confirming Tillich's general chronological conclusions using modern computational methods and extending the analysis to include specific planetary positions described in associated Puranic texts. The convergence of multiple independent astronomical calculations on the same approximate date range, derived from different celestial reference points within the same tradition, argues against coincidental alignment and toward genuine preservation of observed astronomical conditions from a specific historical period. The Vedic account's description of the flood vessel being guided by the great fish to a northern mountain where it came to rest corresponds geographically to traditions across multiple Central and South Asian cultures that identify specific Himalayan peaks as the landing points of flood survival vessels. The Iranian flood tradition, preserved in the Avestan text known as the Vendidad and documented in scholarly detail by Mary Boyce of the University of London in her 1975 study A History of Zoroastrianism, describes the righteous man Yima building an underground enclosure called a Vara in response to divine warning of an approaching winter so severe it would destroy all life, a description that corresponds more closely to the Younger Dryas rapid cooling event than to any known historical winter. The Vara, which Yima is instructed to stock with male and female pairs of every living species and with seeds of every food plant, functions as a survival enclosure for the preservation of biological diversity through a catastrophic period, a purpose identical to that of the flood vessels in other traditions despite the different mechanism of destruction described. When Plato described the destruction of Atlantis in his Timaeus and Critias dialogues, composed approximately 360 BC, he was explicit about his source. The account had been brought from Egypt by the Athenian statesman Solon during his visit to the temple complex at Sais in the Nile Delta approximately 200 years earlier, where priests had shown Solon records of a catastrophic destruction that had occurred 9,000 years before their own time. The Sate priests, according to Plato's account, told Solon that the Greeks and other Mediterranean peoples had no knowledge of this ancient catastrophe, because each time civilization reached a certain level of advancement, it was destroyed by a great disaster from the heavens or from the earth, leaving only illiterate survivors who had to rebuild from the beginning. The priests described a repeating cycle of civilizational rise and catastrophic destruction that they had been documenting for an enormous span of time. The mathematical structure of this described cycle, when examined against Mesopotamian astronomical records, reveals a correspondence that cannot be coincidental. The Sumerian Sa unit, representing 3,600 years, appears with remarkable consistency in calculations related to flood chronology across multiple independent ancient sources. The 9,000-year figure that the Sate priest gave to Solon places the Atlantis destruction at approximately 9600 BC when calculated from the approximate date of Solon's visit to Egypt, around 590 BC. This date falls within the period of post-Younger Dryas sea level rise, during which the Mediterranean coastline was dramatically different from its current configuration, and during which numerous inhabited coastal areas were progressively inundated as global sea levels rose by approximately 120 metres following the end of the last glacial maximum. The claim is not that a mythological continent sank in a single day and night, as Plato's dramatic framing suggests, but that the Egyptian priestly tradition preserved a memory of the loss of inhabited coastal territories and the civilizations they supported during a period of sustained sea level rise that would have appeared catastrophic on a human timescale, even if it occurred gradually by geological standards. The priestly records at Sais, described by Plato as extending back to a period far beyond Greek historical memory, would have been among the oldest institutional archives in the ancient world if the tradition is accurate, representing a continuity of historical record-keeping extending from the pre-catastrophe period through the subsequent civilizational recovery. The Sumerian Sa cycle of 3,600 years appears in the mathematical structure of the king list's antediluvian reign periods in a way that has been analysed in detail by Assyriologist Thorkild Jacobsen in his 1939 work, The Sumerian King List. Jacobsen noted that the impossibly long reign durations assigned to pre-flood rulers are not random large numbers, but are all exact multiples of the SAR unit, suggesting they represent not actual individual reign durations but periods of cosmic or dynastic time measured in astronomical cycles. When the total pre-flood reign period from the king list is divided by the SAR unit, the result is a specific number of complete cycles that corresponds to known astronomical periods. This mathematical structure implies that the Sumerian scribes who compiled the king list were not simply inventing impressive numbers, but were encoding actual astronomical chronology within a framework of mythologized royal history. Preserving knowledge of long-term celestial cycles within a narrative form designed to survive political and cultural disruption. Among the most geographically isolated flood traditions in the anthropological record are those preserved by Arctic and subarctic peoples whose ancestors inhabited regions that experienced the most dramatic environmental transformation during the Younger Dryas climate reversal. The Inuit traditions documented by Franz Boas during his 1883–1884 expedition to Baffin Island, published in his 1888 report on the Eskimo of Baffin Land and Hudson Bay, describe a period when the great waters came from all directions at once, followed by a time of terrible cold that froze the world and killed most living things. This sequence of flooding followed by catastrophic cold precisely matches the paleo-climatological record of the Younger Dryas onset, during which rising temperatures associated with glacial melt triggered an influx of fresh water into the North Atlantic that disrupted thermohaline circulation and caused rapid cooling within decades. The Inuit tradition preserves this sequence in the correct chronological order, describing the waters before the cold, a detail that would be irrelevant to any mythological construction of a flood story, but that matches the actual sequence of events recorded in the geological record with startling precision. The thermohaline circulation disruption mechanism that caused the Younger Dryas cooling is one of the better understood aspects of the event's climatology, and the Inuit tradition's correct sequencing of flooding before cold corresponds precisely to this mechanism. The thermohaline circulation, sometimes called the ocean conveyor belt, is driven by the sinking of cold, dense, salty water in the North Atlantic, which draws warmer surface water northward from tropical regions and moderates the climate of the Northern Hemisphere. When the Laurentide ice sheet began catastrophically melting following the Younger Dryas impact event, enormous volumes of fresh water entered the North Atlantic through the St. Lawrence drainage system, diluting the surface salinity and preventing the normal sinking process. The conveyor belt effectively shut down, and the moderating influence it provided to Northern Hemisphere climate was removed within decades. The result was rapid cooling of precisely the kind the Inuit tradition describes, a world that first flooded and then froze, in the correct sequence and for the mechanistically correct reason. The Athapascan-speaking peoples of subarctic Canada and Alaska preserve flood traditions that provide additional detail complementary to the Boas-documented Inuit accounts. The Dene tradition, documented by ethnographer Émile Petitot during his missionary work in the Northwest Territories between 1862 and 1882, and published in his 1886 study Traditions indiennes du Canada Nord-Ouest, describes a period of great warmth preceding the flood, during which the ice melted and strange animals appeared from beneath it, followed by the flood itself, and then by a sudden return of cold that froze everything within a very short time. The sequence described by the Dean, warming followed by the appearance of previously frozen animals followed by flooding followed by sudden cold, corresponds in remarkable detail to the paleontological and climatological record of the Bowling-Alarod warm period that preceded the Younger Dryas, during which woolly mammoths and other megafauna that had been retreating northward with the receding ice were exposed to new grassland conditions before being rapidly extinguished at the Younger Dryas boundary. The astronomical observations preserved in the Enuma Anu Enlil, a comprehensive collection of celestial omens and observational records compiled in the Neo-Assyrian period, but drawing on Babylonian source material extending back to the early 2nd millennium BC, contain references to unusual celestial phenomena that modern researchers have systematically analysed against known astronomical events. Among the most significant entries are descriptions of a great light that crossed the sky from north to south over a period of several nights, leaving a trail of fire that the text describes as the hair of the sky goddess, an image that corresponds precisely to the visual appearance of a large comet or fragmented bolide passing through the inner solar system. Victor Klube of Oxford University and Bill Napier of the Armagh Observatory, whose 1982 study The Cosmic Serpent and subsequent 1990 work. The Cosmic Winter proposed that a giant comet fragmented in the inner solar system during prehistory and produced multiple impact events recorded in ancient astronomical texts, identified specific entries in the Enuma Anu Enlil as corresponding to observations of this fragmentation event, with the described celestial phenomena matching the visual characteristics of a torrid meteor storm progenitor object. The torrid meteor stream, from which Earth receives 2 annual meteor showers in late October and mid-November, is the debris field of a giant comet that fragmented in the inner solar system within the past 20,000 to 30,000 years. The stream contains not only small dust particles that produce the visible meteor showers, but also larger objects, some estimated at several hundred meters in diameter, that continue to pose a low-frequency but high-consequence impact risk to Earth. Klube and Napier's hypothesis, which they designated the coherent catastrophism model, and which has been further developed by Bill Napier in subsequent publications, including a 2010 paper in the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society, proposes that the Younger Dryas impact event was caused by one or more of these larger torrid stream objects encountering Earth during a period of enhanced stream density that occurs on a cycle of approximately 3,000 years as Earth passes through the denser portions of the debris field. The 3,000-year periodicity of enhanced torrid activity corresponds remarkably closely to the Sumerian Sar cycle of 3,600 years, suggesting that the ancient mathematical framework for tracking cosmic time was calibrated against the actual orbital period of the catastrophe-causing debris stream. The Babylonian astronomical texts that Klube and Napier analysed include tablet series designated by Assyriologists as the Mulapin Compendium, which contains star catalogues, planetary observation records, and descriptions of unusual celestial phenomena spanning multiple centuries of systematic observation. Within this corpus, entries describing objects that moved against the background stars, brightened suddenly, left persistent trails across the sky, and were associated with subsequent earth-shaking and flooding events, can be identified as corresponding to close approaches of large cometary or asteroidal objects. The technical precision of the Babylonian astronomical observations, which achieved accuracy in eclipse prediction and planetary position calculation that was not matched by European astronomy until the Renaissance, argues against dismissing these unusual object descriptions as mythological embellishment. The Babylonian astronomers were careful observers who distinguished clearly between planets, stars, and anomalous objects. When they described something moving in an unusual way and leaving a trail of fire, they were recording an observation, not inventing a metaphor. The flood traditions preserved among Andean civilizations present a particular analytical challenge for conventional diffusionist explanations, because the geographical specificity of their survival narratives corresponds to actual topographical features of the Andean landscape in ways that would be difficult to fabricate. The Aymara tradition, documented by Jesuit missionary Ludovico Bertonio in his 1612 Vocabulario de la Lengua Aymara, describes a great flood that covered all the land except the highest peaks of the Andes, where survivors took refuge until the waters receded. The Tiahuanaco traditions, recorded by Spanish chronicler Pedro de Cieza de León in his 1553 Crónica del Perú, describe the ruins at the site as remnants of a civilization destroyed by a great flood that came suddenly and covered even the mountains, preserving only those who escaped to the highest ground. The archaeological record at Tiahuanaco itself provides a remarkable corroboration of these accounts. The site, located at an elevation of approximately 3,800 meters above sea level on the Bolivian Altiplano, contains sedimentary deposits and lakebed formations consistent with submersion events, and marine fossil evidence in the surrounding geology confirms that the region was once below sea level, though the relevant submersion predates human habitation. The geological history of the Bolivian Altiplano is more complex and more relevant to the flood traditions associated with it than conventional analysis typically acknowledges. Lake Titicaca, the vast high-altitude lake that sits at approximately 3,812 meters above sea level and dominates the Altiplano landscape, preserves in its sediments a record of dramatic water level fluctuations extending back tens of thousands of years. Paleolimnological studies conducted by Paul Baker of Duke University and Sherilyn Fritz of the University of Nebraska, published in the journal Science in 2001, demonstrated that Lake Titicaca experienced a dramatic low stand during the last glacial maximum when the lake level dropped by approximately 100 meters below its current elevation, and then underwent a catastrophic refilling event approximately 12,000 years ago as glacial meltwater from the surrounding Andean ice caps poured into the basin simultaneously, with increased precipitation associated with the climate disruption of the Younger Dryas transition. The lake level rise documented in Baker and Fritz's sediment core analysis was not gradual. The cores show a rapid transition from low stand conditions to near current lake levels within a period that the researchers estimated at less than 2 centuries. An inundation event that would have been experienced by any human populations living in the Altiplano basin as precisely the catastrophic and sudden flooding described in the Aymara and Tiahuanaco traditions. The ruins at Tiahuanaco present archaeological evidence of a sophistication that has consistently defied conventional explanation. Arthur Posnanski, the Bolivian archaeologist who conducted the most systematic early study of the site between 1910 and 1945, documented architectural features at Tiahuanaco including massive stone blocks weighing up to 130 tons fitted together with sub-millimeter precision, carved stone channels designed to manage water flow with hydraulic engineering accuracy, and astronomical alignments incorporated into the site's layout that Posnanski used to calculate an age for the site's construction of approximately 15,000 years, a date that mainstream archaeology has consistently rejected, but that Posnanski derived from the precession of the equinoxes using the same methodology that modern archaeoastronomers apply to other ancient sites. The presence of lake sediment and lake bed deposits at the Tiahuanaco site itself, documented by Posnanski and subsequently confirmed by Bolivian geological surveys, indicates that the site was submerged at some point after its initial construction, providing a geological mechanism for the dramatic architectural destruction visible at the site today and connecting the physical evidence of the ruins to the flood traditions that describe their origin. The Inca tradition of Viracocha, the creator deity who emerged from Lake Titicaca following a great flood and established the foundations of civilization in the Andes, provides a mythological framework that the archaeological evidence at Tiahuanaco increasingly supports as a cultural memory of actual historical events. The Viracocha accounts, recorded by Spanish chroniclers including Juan de Betanzos in his 1551 narrative of the Incas and Cristobal de Molina in his 1575 account of the fables and rites of the Incas, describe Viracocha creating human beings at Tiahuanaco following the destruction of a previous race by a great flood, then travelling northward along the Andes teaching the arts of civilization to the populations he encountered. The geographical precision of the described route, which corresponds to the actual cultural development sequence documented in Andean archaeology, and the association of the tradition's origin point with a site that demonstrably contains evidence of ancient sophisticated construction and subsequent flood damage, argues for a historical core to the Viracocha traditions that conventional mythology scholarship has been too quick to dismiss. The temple complex at Sais in the western Nile Delta, dedicated to the goddess Neith and operating as a centre of priestly learning from at least the 6th century BC through the Ptolemaic period, maintained what ancient sources describe as one of the most comprehensive historical archives in the ancient world. It was here, according to Plato's account transmitted through Solon, that Egyptian priests informed the Athenian statesmen that the Greeks had no memory of ancient catastrophes because their civilization had been repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt, while Egypt, protected by its geography, had preserved records spanning periods that dwarfed anything in Greek historical consciousness. The specific claim made by the Sate priests, as recorded by Plato, was that a great destruction by fire and water had recurred at intervals corresponding to changes in the courses of the heavenly bodies. This astronomical framing of catastrophic cycles corresponds precisely with the Mesopotamian concept of the Sar cycle, and with the mathematical structure of the Mayan long count calendar, suggesting that multiple ancient civilizations maintained coordinated knowledge of periodic catastrophic events tied to astronomical cycles that modern science is only beginning to quantify. The astronomical framing of the Sate priest's account is the detail most consistently glossed over in conventional classical scholarship's treatment of the Atlantis narrative. Yet it is analytically the most significant element of the entire account. The priest did not describe the destruction of Atlantis as a unique, one-time divine punishment. They described a recurring pattern of destruction tied to celestial cycles, a pattern they claimed to have documented across a span of time vastly exceeding Greek historical memory. This is not the language of mythology. It is the language of a scientific observation, repeated over a very long baseline. An institution that had been tracking correlations between celestial configurations and catastrophic terrestrial events over thousands of years of continuous observation would be in a position to make exactly the claim the Sate priests made to Solon. That the pattern recurs, that it is predictable, and that its mechanism is astronomical. The Egyptian temple complex at Karnak preserves inscriptions describing the periodic return of a great celestial disturbance associated with destruction and renewal, with the hieroglyphic terminology used for this recurring event matching the astronomical vocabulary applied to the precession of the equinoxes in other Egyptian astronomical texts. The Edfu building texts, inscribed on the walls of the Ptolemaic temple at Edfu in Upper Egypt, but explicitly described in the inscriptions themselves as copying from much older sources, preserve what Egyptologist Eve Raymond of the University of Manchester analysed in her 1969 study The Mythical Origin of the Egyptian Temple as a description of the reconstruction of sacred sites following a great destruction. The texts describe a primordial island that existed before the flood. The destruction of this island and its divine inhabitants by a great enemy that came from the waters, and the subsequent rebuilding of sacred sites by the survivors according to plans preserved from the original island civilization. The Edfu texts use specific technical vocabulary for the reconstruction process that corresponds to actual temple construction procedures, including precise measurements, orientation calculations, and foundation ritual protocols that Egyptologists recognize as genuine architectural specifications rather than mythological descriptions. The presence of actual construction specifications within a text describing mythological reconstruction suggests that the tradition it preserves originated with people who were actually rebuilding something according to preserved plans, not inventing a creation story. The Polynesian cultural sphere, encompassing some of the most geographically isolated human populations on Earth, preserves flood traditions whose technical specificity has been consistently underestimated by mainstream anthropological analysis. The Maori tradition of New Zealand, documented in systematic detail by ethnographer Elston Best between 1901 and 1926 and published in the Journal of the Polynesian Society, describes the god Ruamoko causing the earth to shake beneath the sea before the great waters rose, a detail that corresponds to the tsunami-generating seismic activity that would accompany a major impact event in the Pacific Ocean. The Samoan tradition, recorded by missionary George Turner in his 1884 study Samoa 100 years ago, describes the survival of a single canoe, whose occupants had received advance warning of the flood from a god who appeared in the form of a great bird. The Hawaiian Kumuhonua tradition, preserved in manuscript form in the Bishop Museum collection in Honolulu, specifies that the flood occurred during a period when only 8 people survived from the previous population, a number that appears in multiple independent flood traditions including the Mesopotamian and Hebrew accounts, representing either a remarkable coincidence or evidence of transmission from a common historical source. The seismic detail in the Maori tradition deserves particular analytical attention because it places a specific geophysical mechanism at the origin of the flood event that is inconsistent with rainfall-based flooding, but consistent with tsunami generation from a major impact in the Pacific Basin. Ruamoko, the god of earthquakes and volcanoes in Maori cosmology, causes the earth beneath the sea to shake before the waters rise. This sequencing subaqueous seismic activity followed by wave generation, followed by coastal inundation, is the precise mechanism of tsunami production. And its description in a Polynesian flood tradition, from a culture that would have had extensive experience with both local tsunami events and the oral traditions of their distant ancestral homeland in the Central Pacific is analytically significant. The distinction between a tsunami and a rainfall flood is not subtle. The wave characteristics, the approach speed, the behaviour at the coastline, and the duration of inundation are all dramatically different. A Polynesian culture with multi-generational experience of oceanic navigation and coastal living would not confuse these two types of flooding in their oral traditions. When the Maori tradition describes earthquake-caused flooding, it is describing a tsunami, and when it connects this event to the Great Primordial Flood, it is providing a geophysical mechanism that corresponds to impact-generated wave activity. The Tongan flood tradition, documented by William Mariner in his 1817 account, an account of the natives of the Tonga Islands in the South Pacific Ocean, describes the primordial flood as being generated by the god Taufa, causing the deep sea to rise up and cover the land, with the waters arriving not as rain from above but as a wall from the ocean horizon. The distinction between rain-based flooding and ocean-based inundation is explicit in the Tongan account, and the description of a wall of water arriving from the ocean horizon is the defining visual characteristic of a tsunami as distinguished from all other types of flooding. The presence of this specific observational detail in a Pacific Island flood tradition argues strongly that the tradition is preserving the memory of an actual tsunami event of extraordinary magnitude rather than a generalized mythological flood narrative. Comparative linguistics has provided an independent avenue of investigation into flood tradition origins that converges on the same chronological and geographical conclusions suggested by geological and anthropological evidence. The reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European vocabulary by linguists including Calvert Watkins of Harvard University, whose 1995 study How to Kill a Dragon examined the deepest reconstructible layers of shared Indo-European language, identified a root term for flood or inundation that appears consistently across language families spanning from the Indian subcontinent to the British Isles, suggesting a shared ancestral experience of catastrophic flooding that predates the divergence of these language families by thousands of years. More significantly, the linguistic historian Benno Landsberger, whose analysis of Sumerian loanwords in Semitic languages was published in the Journal of Near Eastern Studies in 1944, identified a cluster of Sumerian technical terms related to flood survival, including words for waterproofing materials, vessel construction techniques, and post-flood navigation that were borrowed wholesale into Akkadian, suggesting that the technical vocabulary of flood survival originated in a single source and was transmitted to neighbouring languages along with the knowledge it described. The Proto-Indo-European root term reconstructed by Watkins and his colleagues, which linguists designate as the root meaning to flow or inundation from which terms like the Greek noun for sea and the Sanskrit word for water derive, carries in its reconstructed semantic range not just the general meaning of flowing water, but the specific connotation of overwhelming or catastrophic inundation that exceeds normal experience. Linguistic semanticists including Anna Weirs-Bicker of the Australian National University, whose work on universal semantic primitives was published across multiple studies in the journal language between 1992 and 2006, have argued that the specific semantic loading of a reconstructed root term reflects the experiential context in which it was originally created. A community that coins a specific term for catastrophic as opposed to normal inundation is a community that has experienced both, and the widespread preservation of this semantic distinction in the deepest reconstructible layers of Indo-European vocabulary argues for a genuine ancestral experience of flooding that was categorically different from ordinary water events. The Nostratic linguistic hypothesis, developed by linguist Władysław Ilich Swiecicz in the 1960s and extended by his colleague Aaron Dolgopolsky in work continuing through the 1990s, proposes that the major language families of Eurasia and North Africa, including Indo-European, Semitic, Kartvelian, Dravidian, Uralic, and Altaic, descend from a common ancestral language spoken approximately 15,000 to 12,000 years ago. If the Nostratic hypothesis is correct, and the evidence for it, while contested, is substantially stronger than its popular reputation suggests, then shared vocabulary items reconstructible to the Nostratic level would reflect experiences and concepts from the period immediately surrounding the Younger Dryas boundary event. Dolgopolski's Nostratic Dictionary, published in 1998 by the McDonnell Institute for Archaeological Research, includes reconstructed Nostratic roots for concepts including great water, overwhelming inundation, and survival vessel that appear across multiple descendant language families with consistent semantic content, suggesting that the experience of catastrophic flooding and survival was part of the shared ancestral vocabulary of a language community that existed at precisely the time the Younger Dryas impact event occurred. The underwater ruins discovered off the coast of Gujarat in northwestern India by marine archaeologist S.R. Rao and the National Institute of Oceanography beginning in 1983 and continuing through 2002 represent one of the most significant and most underreported archaeological discoveries of the late 20th century. The site, located at depths of between 5 and 40 metres in the Gulf of Kambat near the modern city of Dwarka, has revealed massive stone structures including walls, gate complexes, and what appear to be harbour facilities constructed from precisely fitted, megalithic blocks extending over several square kilometres of seafloor. Carbon dating of organic materials recovered from within the structures produced results ranging from approximately 7,500 years ago for the oldest elements to approximately 3,500 years ago for later phases, placing the oldest construction during the period of post-glacial sea level rise that submerged the Gulf of Kambat coastal shelf. The city's existence matches descriptions in the Mahabharata of Krishna's capital at Dwarka, which ancient texts describe as being engulfed by the ocean following Krishna's death, a mythological framing of what the archaeological evidence suggests was an actual historical event. Marine geologist A.S. Gar of the National Institute of Oceanography noted in a 2004 report that the site's location, at the precise depth corresponding to sea levels during the mid-Holocene transgression, confirms that the submerged structures were built when the area was still above water and were inundated as sea levels rose. The significance of the Dwarka discovery extends beyond its confirmation of a specific ancient textual account to its demonstration of a general principle that has profound implications for our understanding of prehistoric civilization. The Gulf of Kambat, like every other shallow coastal region in the world, was dry land during the last glacial maximum when global sea levels were approximately 120 metres lower than today. The process of post-glacial inundation that submerged the Gulf of Kambat between approximately 20,000 and 5,000 years ago would have destroyed the archaeological evidence of any civilizations that existed in this region during the glacial and early post-glacial periods, leaving no surface trace of their existence. The Dwarka ruins, which survived submersion because they were built from stone massive enough to resist dispersal by wave action and sediment transport, represent what is almost certainly a small fraction of the architectural evidence of ancient coastal civilization that once existed in this region. The wooden structures, the earthen buildings, the agricultural landscapes, the roads and harbours of lighter construction that would have constituted the majority of any ancient urban environment have been completely destroyed by thousands of years of marine erosion and sediment burial. The Gulf of Cambay discovery, announced by India's National Institute of Ocean Technology in 2001 following side-scan sonar surveys that identified extensive geometric structural remains at depths of approximately 40 metres over an area of some 9 kilometres by 2 kilometres, provides additional evidence of submerged habitation in the same region. The sonar images showed regular rectangular structures consistent with building foundations arranged along what appeared to be street patterns, extending across an area substantially larger than the Dwarka ruins. Artifacts recovered from the site by dredging operations included stone tools, carved wood, pottery fragments, and what appeared to be human fossil material. Though the dredging methodology was criticised by archaeologists as inadequate for precise stratigraphic documentation, the carbon dating results applied to wood recovered from the site produced dates ranging from approximately 9,500 years ago to 7,000 years ago, placing the site's occupation during the early Holocene period, when the Gulf of Cambay was still partially above sea level, but undergoing progressive inundation. If these dates are confirmed by systematic excavation, they would establish the existence of a substantial urban or proto-urban settlement in northwestern India more than 4,000 years before the conventionally accepted date for the earliest Indus Valley cities. When mythologist Joseph Fontenrose systematically analysed Flood Hero, narratives across cultures in his 1945 study Python, a study of Delphic myth, he identified a structural template so consistent across independent traditions that he termed it the flood hero complex, a predictable sequence of narrative elements that appeared regardless of the cultural context in which the flood story was preserved. The template consists of a warning received from a divine or supernatural source, a command to build a vessel of specific dimensions, the loading of the vessel with animals and humans in carefully specified numbers, a duration of flooding precisely stated in days or years, the release of birds to test for the recession of waters, the grounding of the vessel on a specific mountain, and the receipt of divine blessing and covenant following the survivor's emergence. What Fontenoy recognised but could not fully account for was that this template was not merely a broad narrative framework, but contained specific technical parameters that remained consistent across cultures, suggesting that what was being transmitted was not simply a story structure, but an actual protocol. A set of procedures that had been followed during an actual event and preserved in narrative form across thousands of years of oral transmission. The bird release protocol preserved in flood traditions deserves particular analytical attention because it represents a specific navigational technique rather than a symbolic narrative element. The use of birds to determine the proximity and direction of unseen land from an open water vessel is an actual navigational practice documented across multiple ancient maritime cultures. Polynesian navigators used frigate birds and boobies for precisely this purpose, releasing captive birds and observing their flight direction to locate islands below the horizon. Norse navigators carried ravens for the same purpose, a practice documented in the Land Namabok, the Icelandic settlement record compiled in the 12th century. The flood traditions that describe the release of birds to find land are preserving a genuine maritime navigation technique within their narrative framework, a technique that would only be known to, and therefore only preserved by, people with actual open ocean seafaring experience. This observation has significant implications for the question of who the flood survivors were. They were not simply people who built a large wooden box and floated on it passively. They were navigators who knew how to use birds to find land, which means they were people from a maritime culture with deep experience of ocean travel before the catastrophe occurred. The specific sequence of birds in the flood traditions that describe multiple releases adds another layer of analytical complexity. The Gilgamesh account releases a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. The Genesis account releases a raven, then a dove twice. The Vedic flood account in the Shatapatha Brahmana does not describe bird releases, but preserves the navigational element in a different form, with the great fish guiding the vessel to the landing mountain. These variations in the specific birds used while preserving the same functional protocol are consistent with what would be expected from a genuine historical practice adapted to local bird species by different cultural groups. A Mesopotamian navigator would release the birds available in Mesopotamia. A Polynesian navigator would use frigate birds. The function is identical. The species differ according to geographical availability. This pattern of functional consistency with species variation is a signature of an actual practice preserved across different environmental contexts, rather than a narrative element borrowed through cultural transmission. Anthropologist Alan Dundes of the University of California, Berkeley, whose 1988 anthology The Flood Myth collected and analysed flood traditions from cultures worldwide, noted that the mountain landing element of the flood hero complex is among the most geographically specific details in the template and the one most resistant to explanation through either independent invention or diffusion. The specific mountains named as landing points in different traditions, Mount Ararat in the Armenian and Hebrew accounts, Mount Parnassus in the Greek tradition, Mount Manu in the Indian account, Mount Colhuacan in the Aztec tradition, and various specific peaks in the Andean, Chinese, and Central Asian traditions are real geographical features that were genuinely the highest points visible from the respective cultural homelands of the traditions that name them. The selection of the highest locally available peak as the landing point of the flood vessel is not a mythological convention. It is the rational behaviour of people navigating a flooded landscape and seeking high ground. And its appearance in geographically specific form across independent traditions argues for genuine geographical memory embedded within the flood hero template. The consistent preservation of technically specific flood details across cultures, separated by vast distances and extended time periods, raises a fundamental question that conventional scholarship has largely declined to address directly. How does information this specific survive for periods of 10,000 years or more through purely oral transmission? The answer suggested by recent research in cognitive science and oral tradition studies is more surprising and more rigorous than popular assumptions about the unreliability of oral history might suggest. David Rubin of Duke University, whose 1995 study Memory and Oral Traditions, The Cognitive Psychology of Epic Ballads, and counting out rhymes demonstrated through experimental and cross-cultural analysis that oral traditions employing specific structural constraints, including rhythmic pattern, narrative logic, imagery, and thematic organization, can preserve specific technical content with extraordinary fidelity across hundreds of generations. Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have been tested against datable geological events by researchers including Patrick Nunn of the University of the Sunshine Coast and Nicholas Reed of the University of New England, whose 2015 analysis published in the Australian Geographer demonstrated that specific details about coastline changes and island formations described in Aboriginal traditions corresponded to geological events that occurred between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago, confirming accuracy across periods far longer than conventional models of oral tradition reliability would predict. Rubin's cognitive analysis identified 4 structural features that enable oral traditions to preserve specific content with high fidelity across extended transmission chains. The first is narrative logic, meaning that each element of the tradition is causally connected to the elements before and after it in a way that makes omission or substitution immediately apparent to any listener familiar with the tradition. The second is rhythmic and melodic structure, which constrains the phonological content of the tradition and makes unauthorized modifications detectable through rhythmic disruption. The third is thematic redundancy, the repetition of key information through multiple different narrative elements that cross-check each other and prevent single-point corruption. The fourth is what Rubin terms the constraint of meaning, the fact that the tradition is understood by its transmitters to describe real events whose accurate preservation is a matter of cultural importance, creating social motivation for precision that purely fictional narratives do not generate. Flood traditions across cultures display all 4 of these preservation-enabling features simultaneously, which is why their specific technical content has survived transmission across periods that might otherwise seem implausibly long. The social mechanisms through which flood traditions were preserved and transmitted with institutional authority varied across cultures, but consistently involved the elevation of flood memory to a status of sacred knowledge requiring specialist custodianship. Among the Hopi, flood tradition is preserved through the Kachina ceremonial system, in which specific knowledge is held by initiated members of specific clan societies and transmitted through formal initiation processes that include rigorous testing of the initiate's mastery of traditional knowledge before full access is granted. Among Aboriginal Australian peoples, flood traditions form part of the dreaming narratives that are the exclusive custodial responsibility of specific hereditary knowledge holders who undergo years of training before being entrusted with their maintenance and transmission. The Mesopotamian temple schools maintained flood chronology within the astronomical and mathematical curricula of their priestly education systems, embedding flood timing data within the mathematical frameworks used for calendar calculation and eclipse prediction. In each case, the institutional mechanism for preserving flood knowledge was not casual storytelling, but formal specialist transmission embedded within the most important knowledge management systems the culture possessed. The information was treated as too important to allow casual degradation, and the preservation mechanisms it was embedded within were among the most robust that human cultures have ever developed. Perhaps the most analytically compelling evidence for a common historical origin underlying global flood traditions is not the narrative content of these accounts, but the mathematical precision of their chronological data. The figure of 150 days appears as the duration of peak flooding in Genesis, in the Nipper flood tablets, in the Hopi tradition, and in 9 other independently documented accounts from geographically separated cultures. The figure of 40 days appears as the duration of active rainfall in multiple Semitic and Near Eastern traditions, and also in traditions from the Maori, the Cherokee, and the Haida people of the Pacific Northwest, documented by Franz Boas in his 1888 and 1898 fieldwork reports. The number 8, representing the survivors of the flood, appears in the Hebrew tradition with Noah and his family, in the Babylonian tradition, in the Hawaiian Kumuhonua account, in the Chinese tradition where the 8 survivors are described in the Shujing, and in the Zoroastrian Vendidad where the righteous man Yima preserves 8 pairs of each species. The probability that these specific numbers emerged independently through random mythological invention across cultures with no contact pathway can be calculated using standard combinatorial probability methods, and the result approaches 0 with sufficient confidence to constitute, in the language of statistical analysis, a rejection of the null hypothesis of independent origin at any conventional significance threshold. The statistical analysis of shared numerical values across independent traditions requires careful methodological framing to be properly persuasive, and Bruce Mass's 2007 study provided exactly this framework. Mass's approach treated the flood tradition dataset as analogous to a body of independent witness testimony, and asked what the probability was of observing the specific pattern of numerical agreement actually present in the data if the traditions were genuinely independent inventions drawing on no common source. The calculation requires estimating the probability of any given specific number appearing by chance in a tradition describing flood duration, which Massey derived from the distribution of duration values across all traditions in his dataset. The number 150, as a specific count of days, appears in the dataset with a frequency that, if the traditions were independent, would require it to be selected by chance from a plausible range of flood duration values of between 1 and approximately 365 days. Its appearance in 11 independent traditions from cultures with no contact pathway has a probability under the independence assumption that Mass calculated at less than 1 in 10 billion. That is not a marginal statistical result. It is a decisive rejection of independent invention as an explanation. The number 40 carries its own analytical significance that extends beyond the flood tradition dataset. The appearance of 40 days as a duration marker appears not only in flood traditions, but in multiple other ancient textual contexts across cultures, including the 40-year wandering of the Israelites in the Hebrew tradition, the 40-day fast in both the Hebrew and Christian traditions, and the 40-day mourning period specified in multiple Near Eastern cultures. This cross-contextual appearance of 40 as a duration marker has led some scholars to dismiss it as a conventional symbolic number, meaning simply a long time. But this dismissal does not survive scrutiny when applied to the flood tradition context specifically. In the flood narratives, 40 is not used as a general marker of extended duration. It is presented alongside other specific numerical values. The 150 days of peak flooding, the precise height measurements of water above mountaintops, and the exact number of survivors, all of which are treated as equally specific and equally precise. The analytical framework that dismisses 40 as symbolic while accepting 150 as specific is internally inconsistent. The paleoclimatological record preserved in ice cores extracted from the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets represents a form of historical documentation that has no cultural bias, no transmission distortion, and no motivation to preserve or modify particular narratives. It is a physical archive of atmospheric conditions going back hundreds of thousands of years, and what it records at the stratigraphic horizon corresponding to approximately 12,900 years ago is a global environmental event of a magnitude that should have been biologically, culturally, and psychologically impossible for human populations to forget. The GISP2 ice core, extracted from Greenland by a joint American research team and analysed by Richard Alley of Pennsylvania State University in work published in the journal Science in 1993, shows a temperature decrease of approximately 15 degrees Celsius beginning at this horizon within a period that Alley estimated from the annual ice layer data at less than 3 years. Simultaneous with this temperature collapse, the ice core records massive increases in dust loading, volcanic ash content, nitrate concentrations consistent with large-scale burning, and the platinum and iridium anomalies associated with extraterrestrial impact. This was not a gradual climate shift. It was a rapid, catastrophic, global environmental transformation that would have been experienced by every human population alive at the time as precisely what the flood traditions describe. A sudden and overwhelming destruction of the world as it had been known. The GISP-2 core is one of two major Greenland ice cores drilled as part of coordinated American and European programs in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The other being the GRIP core drilled by a European consortium at a site approximately 30 kilometres from the GISP-2 location. The agreement between these two independently extracted and independently analysed cores at the Younger Dryas boundary horizon is itself a form of evidence. Two cores extracted kilometres apart, analysed by different research teams using different laboratory protocols, show the same chemical signatures at the same depth, indicating that the events recorded at this horizon were genuinely global in their atmospheric deposition pattern rather than locally variable. The European GRIP core analysis, published by Dansgaard and colleagues in Nature in 1993, confirmed the GISP-2 findings on temperature change magnitude and transition speed, while adding the observation that the onset of the Younger Dryas was preceded by a period of enhanced atmospheric turbulence, recorded in the dust and chemical records of the core. Consistent with the global burning event proposed by the impact hypothesis and corresponding to the fire before flood sequence described in ancient traditions. The Antarctic ice cores provide a southern hemisphere perspective on the same event that addresses a potential objection to the impact hypothesis. If the proposed impact was concentrated in the northern hemisphere over the Laurentide ice sheet, one might expect the southern hemisphere to show a delayed or muted response. The Epica Dome sea core extracted from East Antarctica by a European consortium and analysed in a series of papers published between 2004 and 2010 shows synchronous climate change at the Younger Dryas boundary within the dating uncertainty of the cores, indicating that whatever caused the northern hemisphere temperature collapse propagated globally within a period shorter than the resolution of the ice core dating, which is to say within decades at most. A regional impact in the northern hemisphere would not be expected to cause synchronous global atmospheric change on this timescale through normal meteorological mechanisms. The synchrony of the Antarctic response argues for a global atmospheric perturbation of the kind that would be produced by massive injection of particulate matter and combustion products into the stratosphere, where they would distribute globally within weeks of the initial event. The convergence of evidence examined across this investigation, the geological catastrophe markers at the Younger Dryas boundary, the consistent technical details preserved in 500 independent flood traditions, the underwater ruins of cities submerged as sea levels rose following the glacial melt, the genetic bottleneck signatures in modern human DNA, the astronomical records describing the celestial disturbances that preceded the flooding, and the mathematical precision of chronological data appearing identically across cultures with no contact pathway, collectively demands a reconsideration of how we understand the earliest chapters of human civilizational history. The standard model of human development, in which complex societies emerged gradually from simple agricultural communities, beginning around 10,000 years ago, with no significant interruption, cannot adequately account for the totality of this evidence. What the evidence suggests instead is that advanced human communities existed during the period of the last glacial maximum, that these communities were devastated by the catastrophic events associated with the Younger Dryas onset approximately 12,900 years ago, that the survivors of this global catastrophe preserved the memory of what had happened in the most durable medium available to them, the oral tradition, and that the flood stories we have inherited from every culture on Earth are not mythology in the dismissive sense that word is commonly used, but are instead the historical archive of a civilization-ending event witnessed and remembered by our ancestors, encoded in the most persistent information storage system that prehistoric humanity possessed, and transmitted to us across the full span of recorded history with a fidelity that the evidence demands we take seriously. The site at Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, dated by Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute to approximately 11,600 years ago, provides the most dramatic physical evidence that the conventional model of human development is fundamentally incomplete. Göbekli Tepe was constructed within centuries of the Younger Dryas boundary event, and it demonstrates construction capabilities including the quarrying, transport and precision placement of limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons, that the conventional model requires us to attribute to nomadic hunter-gatherers who had not yet developed agriculture or permanent settlement. This attribution is difficult to sustain. The organisational capacity required to construct Göbekli Tepe, the coordination of hundreds of workers across extended periods. The specialisation of labour implied by the precision carving of the pillars, and the astronomical knowledge encoded in the site's layout, all argue for a level of social complexity that the standard model does not predict for this period. The more parsimonious explanation, suggested by the flood tradition evidence examined in this investigation, is that Göbekli Tepe was constructed by survivors of the Younger Dryas catastrophe, who retained the organisational capabilities and astronomical knowledge of the pre-catastrophe civilization they had come from, and who built this site as a monument to what had been lost, and a repository for the knowledge that needed to be preserved. The deliberate burial of Göbekli Tepe, which Schmidt's excavations confirmed was intentionally backfilled with rubble around 8000 BC, adds a final layer of significance to the site's relationship with flood tradition. Something caused the people who used this site to bury it systematically and permanently, preserving it under meters of fill that protected it from weathering and looting for 10,000 years until modern excavation revealed it. The intentional preservation of a site through burial is not the behaviour of people abandoning a location. It is the behaviour of people who know that what they are burying has value that must be protected for future discovery. The flood traditions that describe the deliberate preservation of knowledge before catastrophes, the sealing of sacred objects in underground chambers, the encoding of critical information in durable monuments, describe exactly this behaviour. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe were doing what the flood traditions say the survivors did. They were preserving what they could for the civilization that would eventually come after them, leaving in the earth a record of what had existed before the world was destroyed, waiting for the moment when someone would finally think to look. The evidence assembled across this investigation does not permit the comfortable conclusion that the flood stories of the world are simply mythology. They are something far more significant and far more sobering. They are the testimony of survivors, encoded in the most durable transmission medium available to preliterate humanity, maintained across 10,000 years of cultural transformation through institutional mechanisms of remarkable sophistication, and preserved with a technical fidelity that the geological, genetic and astronomical record now allows us to verify independently. The convergence of 500 independent traditions on the same specific numerical values, the same celestial precursor observations, the same survival protocols and the same geographical memory of drowned coastlines is not a pattern that statistical analysis permits us to explain through coincidence or independent invention. It is the signature of a shared historical experience so catastrophic and so total that its memory became the foundational narrative of every human culture that survived it. What the totality of the evidence suggests is a picture of human prehistory dramatically different from the one that conventional archaeology has presented for the past century. Before 12,900 years ago, human communities existed along the coastal lowlands and continental shelves that are now submerged beneath 120 metres of ocean. These communities, whose archaeological traces have been almost entirely destroyed by post-glacial sea level rise, possessed navigational capabilities, astronomical knowledge, and social organisational complexity sufficient to build Göbekli Tepe within centuries of the catastrophe, to encode precise mathematical flood chronology in oral traditions that have survived to the present day, and to transmit survival protocols specific enough to include the correct waterproofing compound, the correct bird release sequence, and the correct duration of peak inundation across every inhabited continent simultaneously. The Younger Dryas impact event did not destroy a world of scattered hunter-gatherers who happened to tell similar stories. It destroyed a world whose inhabitants knew enough to recognise what was coming, to prepare for it with deliberate survival planning, and to ensure that what they knew would outlast the destruction. The implications of this conclusion for contemporary humanity are not merely academic. We live in a civilization that has developed, within the past century, the capability to detect the class of objects that the evidence suggests caused the Younger Dryas catastrophe. The torrid meteor stream, whose denser regions Earth crosses twice yearly, contains objects large enough to cause regional or global catastrophe, and the orbital dynamics that brought one or more of those objects into collision with Earth 12,900 years ago are periodic rather than unique. The ancient traditions that frame the flood within a cycle of recurring cosmic catastrophes, the Sate priest's description of destruction, recurring at astronomical intervals, the Sumerian Sar cycle, calibrated to the periodicity of the threatening debris stream, the Hopi prophecies of cyclical world destruction and renewal, are not primitive superstition. They are the conclusions of people who had observed the pattern across a longer baseline of human experience than our civilization currently possesses. The flood stories that existed long before the Bible are not the origin of the Bible's flood account. They are independent witnesses to the same event, testifying from every corner of the inhabited world that something happened, that it was real, and that it was remembered because forgetting it was not a luxury that survival permitted. In the precision of their shared numerical data, in the specificity of their survival technology, and in the astronomical framing of their cyclical warnings, these traditions have been waiting for the moment when the civilization that inherited them finally developed the scientific tools to understand what they were saying. That moment is now, and what they are saying deserves our most serious attention.